Hello, and welcome to the Creative Academy, your go-to source for accountability, community, and writing. I am Eileen Cook, and I'm super excited to have with me today my friend Laurel Greer. I know Laurel, I think originally through the Surrey conference, but we also have a lot of mutual friends, so it's a little hard to know where that connection initially came from, but she's been knocking around for a while. I'm going to read her bio to you all so you can find her. Laurel was raised in a small town on Vancouver Island. She grew up skiing and boating by day and reading romances under the covers by flashlight at night. Uh, there's something about reading romance under the cover that just calls for a joke, but I'm not going to say it. Ever committed to the proper placement of the Canadian A, she loves to write books with snapping sexual tension and second chances. She currently lives outside Vancouver with her law-talking husband and her two daughters. And one of my favorite things about her, at least half of her diet is made up of tea, which is why we are no doubt friends. Laurel, Laurel is the author of several books that are the Sutter Creek series, and they are A Father for Her Child, and those came out with Harlequin Special Edition. Is that correct?
Yeah, A Father for Her Child is coming out in July.
Yoo-hoo! So put that up. It's coming up, people. And I asked Laurel to come here today to talk to us a little bit about writing romance. But before we kind of jump into that, I'm curious what got you writing romance. Clearly you were a reader. Was that your gateway drug?
Absolutely. And I think it is for most romance writers, to be honest. And I started reading romance when I was 12, maybe.
Oh,
I know. And, but I think that's a good thing. It gives you a lot of positive messages from a young age about agency and female empowerment and a couple who's equal. And so yeah, I started as a reader, and I remember writing some romance for my 8th grade English teacher, and he was horrified.
best thing to do ever.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then I just kept being a reader until I was about 25 and finished school. And it was during one of the NHL strikes. And my husband and I are big hockey fans, so it takes up a big chunk of your week, 3 hours at a time, 4 days kind of deal. So I had all of this time, and I read a hockey romance, which was the first hockey romance I'd ever read. And I think it was by Rachel Gibson, and lots of people read it at the time. It's a huge subgenre now, but it wasn't at the time. And I thought to myself, I could do this, which I could now, like 15 years later. But that's what got me started in it. And then there was a lot of learning since, obviously. And I started writing in Montana, our Montana-based series, after I went on a road trip about a decade ago with one of my good critique partners. And I was hooked.
There you go. So I think two things that stuck out for me. One is if you like hockey romances, be sure to check out Odette Stone because her
Yes.
books are lovely.
Yes,
So I'm going to give her a shout out for that. And two, I
absolutely.
think it's so important because I think people don't think of it, but that romance is a feminist kind of writing. Like,
It is.
and we
Yeah.
like romance. Like that is what drives so many of us. And I think it gets caught up in, oh, it's a bodice ripper. That's of course the term that they use. And it's so much more than that. There's romance for everyone, depending what your flavor is.
Absolutely. Romance has really evolved. Like there used to be a number, like back in the 80s and early 90s, romance wasn't as equal and wasn't as feminist. But as feminism has become more important to people in that 30-year spread, and I think as more young women start to read it, they've started to demand and want product from with feminist messages in it. And, it's a lot of stories that just from the female gaze instead, and that prioritizes a relationship and to an extent pleasure, but that's not always that's not always a component of every romance, but just a happy ending for everybody.
Ooh, I think that is a segue. So I want us to talk about, look at that. I love when that happens. When we have kind of a natural transition. So we're going to talk about kind of the 5 things that people should know about writing romance. And
Right.
what I thought was interesting is when we decided to have this talk, you mentioned that starting with the end is important. So you kind of just mentioned that. Can you tell us a little more?
It is, yeah. There are a lot of misconceptions about what actually is a romance novel. because there are a lot of books that have romance in them, but that don't classify as a romance novel because they don't have a really key component being a happy ending. And you'll hear two acronyms, the HEA, happily ever after, or more recently, it's become more popularly HFN, happy for now. So to be a romance novel, you need to have the couple, or trio or quartet, because there are obviously menage romances that are popular. The pairing or other needs to be in a committed relationship of their defining at the end of it. They don't need to be engaged. They don't need to be married, though that is pretty common in a lot. But they need to have changed. Each of them needs to have changed over the course of the story to allow themselves to be together and to be committed to each other.
So a main character shouldn't drop dead or go back to their original spouse.
No, absolutely not. And there are many books that have romance in them where you don't necessarily get that commitment at the end, and they're wonderful. Some of them fall into literary fiction, some of them fall into women's fiction. But in that case, because the point of a romance novel, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, segueing into point number 2, the point of the romance novel is a successful relationship. If that's not what you have at the end, you haven't delivered on your promise.
So point 2 kind of comes down to, point 2 is that basically the point of the book
Yes.
is the romance. And if you take that out of it, you don't have a book.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I had, that the romantic journey drives the plot of the book. The traditional arc of a story that you follow, the peaks and valleys, when you have the really high peaks and you have the really low lows in a romance novel, those are intrinsically tied to the relationship. The point where they recognize there might be problems, but they decide to push forward anyways and keep trying, that's often around the midpoint. And it often is tied to increased intimacy, like some sort of step forward with that. And then a really low point, hitting, sorry, I'm making hand gestures and they're not.
I do it all the time. I have to sit on mine.
They're off screen. The really low point, the black moment of the book has to do with them deciding that, there's something inside them that's lacking and this relationship has fallen apart on them. And then, of course, they need to decide, hey, hang on, it's not lacking, and find something within themselves to then move forward and then usually eat some crow.
Yeah. And then there's your happily ever after.
Exactly.
So if I'm understanding you right, if I was writing a romance that was also a thriller, so it had a mystery component to it,
yes,
the key points of the story aren't necessarily like, oh, I found this clue and it's changed the mystery. It's the relationship.
Right. Yeah, I think it would be the difference between like romantic suspense and a suspense with romance in it. In a romantic suspense, the romance is the main plot and the suspense is the subplot.
Yeah.
And versus a suspense with romance in it, which can also be done very well. The romance is the subplot, but you could take the romance out and still have that successful suspense there. If you take the romance out of a romance novel, it's not a novel anymore.
Yeah, you've blown it.
Yeah, exactly.
You've ruined everything.
Yeah.
So what would point 3 be then?
Point 3 is the idea that because that romance is so important to the book, the conflict needs to be inside themselves. There are going to be external conflicts, obviously, because something has to happen outside of them getting together, and so often you'll see them be workplace conflicts, or, the family ranch is falling apart and they need to save the ranch. And often you'll see two people who are going to fall in love pitted at the opposite sides of the external plot. Like the environmentalist and the oil baron or something like that. But at the end, or the core of the story needs to be something inside them is preventing them from being a good partner. Something inside them is preventing them from taking a step forward and being in a committed relationship. And it's often, fear of commitment. It's the stuff that everyone deals with. I mean, and I think that's why romance is often really attractive to people, because it's somewhat a little bit of fantasy and escape, but often it's really just the struggles that we go through on a daily basis. Like, am I good enough? Am I lovable? Can I take this risk and not be absolutely, setting myself up to be rejected? So those are often the internal conflicts that keep people apart internally until the end, when they're like, hey, no, this will work.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot in the Creative Academy about, characters know the external conflict, but they may not know their internal conflict. And I wonder if you could give us an example from one of your books, like what the external conflict is and like one of the internal conflicts for either the hero or the heroine.
Okay, so the one I have coming out, a father for her child, the trope, because I write what's called category romance, which we'll get to in point 5. And so you often have a really recognizable trope, or AKA cliche, really, or a classic theme. And so in this case, it's his best friend's widow. Okay. So on the external, a couple of conflicts that they have going on is nervous about dating each other for that. Yeah. Because of, best friend's widow. Also, he has broken his leg on the job and needs to heal in time to be able to complete a skiing video that will honor his best friend who died in an avalanche. And she is his physical therapist, or physiotherapist if you're Canadian. And so she has promised to help him heal quickly enough. So externally they're working together, but of course now ethically she's starting to fall in love with him. So can she keep helping him ethically? And so she's sort of torn between her feelings and helping him get to his video on the time. She has some of the pretty classic, like, fears of being hurt again, fears of commitment.
I think that's fair.
It's about 18 months out from when she was widowed. And he has a very strong sense of honor and of the promises that he's made to his friend, which his honor, he's got this honor code. And so he internally is very torn about keeping promises to his best friend and being able to move forward as well. Did I explain that well enough?
You did, and now I want to read it even more. Although it doesn't have hockey, so I'm a little disappointed.
No, that's the funny thing. I got into writing with hockey, and then I moved to a ski town.
Well, that's all right. We'll let it go this time, but sometime you're going to take us back.
Okay,
that's pretty dreamy too.
Yeah.
But those hockey boys, I don't know.
I know. One day.
All right. What's point number 4?
Point number 4 is the idea of intimacy. And that just reminding people there's such a range of intimacy in romance novels themselves, because romance novels so often have that reputation for the term bodice ripper, which goes back to when, unfortunately, there were actual rape scenes in novels. And that obviously was a real power imbalance, which is something that has to be done it has a place in some books, but it doesn't have a place in romance novels anymore. Yeah. Because you want these two people to be in a relationship that's trusting and caring and positive by the end of it. And for most people, that is something that you cannot overcome.
No.
So you have this real tie to the violence, and the awful. But there are. I just wanted to remind people that there's such a range of what's in romance novels. You go from just kissing, very much. There are a ton of inspirational romances out there that have a faith component to them, and then there are what would probably be titled sweet romances that don't necessarily have that faith component, but really have very little intimacy at all. There will be some romantic tension, but there won't be, but you won't see very much intimacy at all on the page. ranging all the way up to more erotic romance that has quite a lot of graphic sex in it. But that for a romance novel, there are novels that are erotica that are written, and the point of that is to have erotic sex, and then there's a plot on the side. So for erotic romance, you have very detailed sex scenes, but the relationship and the emotions is still really what's critical.
And that's kind of going back to your second point, isn't it? Like where romance has to be the central thing. And I think that's so important, because I think people get caught sometimes like, oh, I would be too, anxious to write a romance. I could never, use the word nipple in a sentence or whatever. And so they're freaked out about it. Is understand that romance really has this huge range.
It really is. And you can have a very detailed scene that has a lot of very detailed sexual language in it. But as a reader, it absolutely falls flat because it lacks the emotion, it lacks the connection for the characters, it lacks the emotional risk for the characters. What actually makes an intimate scene, regardless of the level of sexuality in it, successful, is how much are the characters feeling, ergo how much are you as a reader feeling. Yeah. And so in it, I always say that for every intimate scene, it has to then cause more emotional risk for them. It has to cause more problems for them. And it can cause external problems too. If you have two people who, like Romeo and Juliet style, shouldn't be dating for whatever reason, but internally it should threaten their fatal flaw or their void or their wound or whatever term you tend to use.
Well, that's about being vulnerable, isn't it? Because yes. I mean, I think, like when you talk about relationships, and it's, whether that's a friendship or a romantic relationship, and anything where you're going to be emotionally intimate with someone, you have to be fairly vulnerable to do that. And that's really scary. And sexuality is just another great way of sort of showing that vulnerability. If you let yourself be truly naked in front of someone, that's taking a risk.
Yes.
Especially if bright lights are involved. Then it definitely can involve, a little bit of extra vulnerability.
Yeah. I read a great one the other day that had to do with a woman who was really working past body image issues.
Yeah.
And it was called The Misadventures of a Curvy Girl, I believe. It was by Sierra Simone, who writes some really hot romance. But they're exceptional. And it was really refreshing to read one where you had someone who was a size 18 who had already worked past feeling bad about being a size 18 and had accepted this is who she was, and had some really lovely intimate moments. And there was never any question because this was one that was actually a menage romance, and so there were two heroes and they both just loved her, and from their point of view it never, her body image issues never came into it. It was a part of the climax for her, but no, it was a really, really well written romance.
We're adding to our to be read pile.
Isn't that I know. I've been listening to Sarah and Jen Reed's Romance. They have a podcast, and every second week they just cover a trope. And I'm like, okay, there's 5 more books that I'm gonna have to read.
That's the best part about being a writer is your read pile never disappears. It just
never. I'm still working through my freebies from the last RWA conference last summer.
I am moving, so I'm packing books, so I'm having to do the great culling, and it's like very Hunger Games over here about who will survive the bookshelf purge.
No doubt.
All right, so tell us what number 5 is.
Number 5 has to do with length, in that, just for those who aren't really familiar with the genre, knowing that you can write almost any length. There are some limits at the upper end. You don't see a lot of the real epic 100,000 to 120,000 ones being published by traditional print publishers at the moment. There are some indie authors who go over the 100,000, but with the print market, romance tends to cap out at 100,000.
Yeah.
But with the advent of self-publishing and indie publishing, it's really opened up short stories, novelettes. I have a novelette that I've given away for free. I do have it up on Amazon right now. But
Is this the Better Than Gold?
Yeah.
I like the sports stories, you can tell. So it's about an Olympic rower for people.
Yeah, it's my Olympic story. So that one's only 10,000 words.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you'll get a novella that kind of goes up to about 40,000 words. Category romance is what I currently am writing most right now, which is for my Harlequin line. And I think Entangled does a fair amount of category length. And then there's 11 other Harlequin lines as well. And then there are people who self-publish that length as well. And it sort of ranges usually from about 45,000 words to 65,000 words, give or take. And then above that, you'd be looking at more single title, sort of roughly in the 70 to 100,000 word range. And the difference is just the smaller you get, the smaller the conflict has to be, or the smaller the problem. Or you'd have to take out subplots. Really, like with category romance, and this is something where my line actually is starting to change a little bit. They recently, for starting in 2020, they're going to up the word count a little bit to allow us a little bit more room for subplots. But you really have to focus in on the relationship and the crux of the relationship and what's keeping them apart, and having sort of one singular external conflict, and really minimizing the number of scenes that don't directly involve the hero and heroine, or the hero and the hero, or heroine and heroine. Versus a single title, you're going to get more subplots.
And romance readers are pretty voracious readers. Like, I think that's in some ways why category became so popular, is it was the thing where people were inhaling books.
Yeah.
And they wanted that, you know, probably because they're fitting it in among the million of other things that they're doing. But they're wanting, you know, a story that they can sit down, digest, enjoy, and then go on to the next one as well.
Yeah, certainly. And it's if you're not looking for something that's going to take you a month to get through, having shorter options is really nice.
And so romance, would you say it's still a booming business in terms of all the books? Like, it seems to be the genre that I still see every place. So it's definitely worthwhile.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the publishing industry in general is changing. There's the shelves, the physical shelves are shrinking. And so there is less room on physical shelves for many authors. But the digital world is expanding to a large extent. And to my knowledge, I think it's $1 billion industry.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I'm pretty sure it hits $1 billion in sales a year at least. I don't have recent statistics in front of me, but it's extremely, it's an extremely successful business. I will admit, like, it's more of a business than I realized, and I'm sure you found this too, like how much you have to become a marketer and a publicist, and you can hire people to do that, of course, who are extremely competent, but that takes money, and so you either need to invest your time or you need to invest your money once you get to the point where you're actually wanting to see your book in print, be it digitally in print or physically in print.
And I would encourage people, even if they're not interested in writing romance themselves, to read in the romance genre for a few reasons. One is, I think people think, oh, it's just a light, fluffy book. And I think they would be quite surprised by what is out there. And also so many books, again, you know, as you talked about, you know, they might be a suspense book with a romantic subplot, or a mystery with a romantic subplot, or a horror novel that happens to have a romantic subplot. And reading romance writers will teach you how to get that emotional connection. And Definitely. It's so important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah. And if anybody wants any recommendations, shoot me an email and let me know what you do read. And I'm happy to try and find something that matches up a little bit with what you already read, but provides you a little bit more into the romance field.
That's fantastic. So what is your website, Laurel?
www.laurel, Laurel, Greer, Greer.com.
Perfect. And are you on Twitter and all the things as well?
I am, yeah. And the connections are all on my website, but Twitter, I'm _ Laurel Greer, all one word, or Facebook page is Laurel Greer author, I believe.
I can never remember those things. I'm the worst. People are like, "What's your Twitter?" I'm like, well, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. I've been liking Instagram a lot lately, actually.
The bookstagrammers, they're awesome to meet and interact with. So it's
I like the format of it. I find I've never caught on to Twitter.
Oh, I did. I
Yeah,
have a little Twitter habit, but it's okay. I'm working on it.
I like seeing Twitter, but I don't feel I'm very good at it. But yeah, I'd say, and I do have an author. I have a profile page for Facebook, and then I also have my author page.
So we can definitely find you. So I would encourage everyone to check Laurel out. And she has a new book coming out in July, A Father for Her Child. So you want to be sure to check that out. And I want to thank her so much for sharing with us 5 things you need to know about writing romance. So
thank you.
Then, any last words, Laurel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if I can throw in one last plug, I do a monthly newsletter, and next month is the final chapter, and then there'll be one more after it of an epilogue of a novella that connects to my Cider Creek series that I've been putting in one chapter a month. So if you want to try out my writing, it's free for newsletter subscribers, and the links are on my website as to how to subscribe for my newsletter. I only do one a month.
And a great way to check out other newsletters, because we get a lot of people who are interested in that as well. So
yeah, so you'll be able to catch the whole novella still for the next couple of months.
You never go wrong with free words. All right. Thanks so much to Laurel, and to everyone else. We hope to see you around the Academy. Thanks so much.
Are you a member yet? Join us today and unlock a wealth of resources, masterclasses, feedback opportunities, and community events designed to help you reach the next step in your writing journey. No matter what stage you're at, we've got a helping hand to guide you along the way. Check out our free resource room if you'd like to get a taste of how we can help you reach your writing and publishing goals. Thanks for bringing us along on your writing and publishing journey. Donna, Crystal, and I hope we'll see you around the Creative Academy soon.